What you working on?
I'm just working with some templates.
Templates, yeah. Of course. Templates.
Hey, man, can you grab me that template? All right, I'm being totally honest when I say this. The single best technique I learned that progressed my furniture making was how and when to utilize templates. I know these days people, and especially people on the internet, talk in hyperbole, but I promise this one is accurate. To me, the difference between good furniture and great furniture is the little details. And in the aesthetic that I'm drawn to the most, things like complex shapes, smooth transitions, and perfectly duplicated parts are critical. And unsurprisingly, one of the best ways to achieve these attributes is to use templates. So I want to go over the entire process of actually making and using templates, while also talking about how, when, and why we use templates. And luckily I'm starting a new dining table build, which there's going to be a set of plans for in the near future. So I'm going to explain everything in the context of that piece. All right, let's get into it and start at the beginning with the question, what materials do we use for templates? Well, I'm glad you asked because there are quite a few answers. There are plenty of different materials that make for good templates, and it also depends on the application. Anything from paper to plywood or cardboard to cocobolo. So let's talk about what materials make the most sense for specific applications, and I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorites. All right, let's start with paper. You might be thinking, we have all these big machines to cut wood, why would I use paper? And to that I would say, prepare yourself for a couple reasons. First, and probably the most obvious, is you might not have a CNC machine, but I would bet you have a printer, or at least access to one. So printing a perfectly accurate template and sticking it to whatever material is a good place to start. From there, let's move on to MDF, and more specifically 1/4 inch MDF, which is my personal favorite. MDF has all of the properties that make it great for making templates. It's cheap, it's easy to cut and shape, and it holds up relatively well to repeated use. It's great if you have a CNC machine, and it's great if you want to make your templates by hand. MDF is great, just don't breathe the dust. Basically, my school of thought is if I know I'm going to use a template more than once, I'll make it out of MDF. And honestly, this is probably at least 97% of the time. I might only be making one table, but that table needs 2 sets of legs, so MDF it is. So once we've chosen a material, we can now start thinking about getting our shape onto said material. So let's try to go in a logical order here, and that is in order of the user's digital aptitude. Don't worry, it'll make sense. So let's start at full analog. You don't have a CNC router, and you do all of your designs by hand with a pencil and paper, even if you're terrible at drawing. Sounds a little crazy, but this is actually how I made all of my templates for years, and it's really just a matter of being able to scale your designs up to full size on a sheet of MDF. A long straight edge, a pencil, and some different radius curves are usually enough to get it done. Oh, and an eraser. Definitely get an eraser. Okay, from there, let's say you still don't have a CNC router, but you design everything on the computer. Seems like a good time to utilize that printer and print some paper templates. Simple enough, just print it out, stitch it together with tape, then adhere it to either your actual workpiece if you're only making one, spray adhesive works great here, or stick it to some MDF and now you're making a reusable template, and bada bing bada bam, Bob's your cousin. Okay, last scenario on the digital aptitude spectrum, you're a computer whiz and you have a CNC router to do all the work for you. Most CNC software can use vector files to cut out shapes, and most design software can export vector files from a 3D model. So with a little bit of computer work, you can easily transfer a template shape from a design to your CNC software to be cut.
It's almost too easy.
Which brings us to the next step, and arguably the most important step of the whole process, and that's actually cutting out your template. And of course, there are plenty of ways to do this. At the most simple, you could take your MDF with either a paper template or your full-scale drawing and cut out the shape with something like a jigsaw, then finesse all the shapes with sanding. Things like a belt sander and spindle sanders are great for this. Another option that works well if your parts have a lot of straight lines is to use a track saw or a circular saw on a straight edge to cut all of these straight parts. Then use a jigsaw to cut all the curved areas, which can then be finessed with sanding. This technique will give you a super clean and accurate template with minimal sanding needed. Lastly, and pretty obviously, you can use a CNC router to cut out the template, so just sit back and relax and watch it happen. Regardless of the approach, this step is the most critical part of the process because it's where you actually create the shape that your final piece will have. Taking your time here is absolutely worth it, as it will save you headaches down the line when you're cutting into that expensive lumber. So now that we have finished templates, no matter how we got here, it's time to use them on the real thing. And this is one of the first places that having a template can be super useful. When laying out parts and trying to maximize material usage, having a template allows us to perfectly visualize where and how many parts we can get from different pieces of lumber. Things like avoiding defects or finding the perfect grain orientation is simple when you can place the actual part and then trace it out. It also allows us to more effectively break down large pieces of lumber. Instead of arbitrarily cutting a long board into smaller chunks and estimating how it will all come out, I can place all the parts I need on a board, then use a circular saw or a jigsaw or both to more efficiently break down my material into more manageable chunks. From there, I can rough cut my parts to get them ready for final shaping. I always like to use a marker when tracing out the final shape before rough cutting, as the thicker line is not only easier to see, but also when I'm cutting the parts out on my bandsaw, if I just hit the outside edge of the line, the final trimming process is much easier. So now that we've trimmed away most of that extra material, let's talk about this month's feature viewer project, which comes from Rico Van Esser. Rico made this amazing table that looks like a tree, which is made out of ash hardwood that I can only guess came from a tree. He made this table while studying interior and furniture design and was tasked with creating a piece of furniture based on biomimicry. If you want to take a closer look and read more about this piece, go check out our website, which we'll link to in the description. We're going to be featuring a new project each month, and we're happy to be using Squarespace to help us build the website. Both Chris and I have been using Squarespace to build and maintain our websites for years now, and honestly, it's one of the best choices we made when starting our businesses. At the time, I had no idea what I needed to do to build a website, but Squarespace makes it super easy to get up and running with plenty of professional looking templates to choose from, as well as making things like purchasing domains really simple. Squarespace also has plenty of e-commerce tools to help you grow your business, things like inventory management, a simple and secure checkout process, and unlimited products allow us to easily manage online transactions and not get bogged down with mundane tasks so that we can devote more time to doing the things we enjoy, like making some furniture templates or a tree table. So if you're thinking about starting a website, or even if you already have one, go check out Squarespace to see if it might be a better option for you. Head over to squarespace.com/4eyes for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, use the offer code 4eyes to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. All right, thanks Squarespace. And if you want to have one of your projects featured, check out the link in the description for more details. So we currently have all of our parts rough cut and ready for trimming. Personally, I like to trim everything to final shape before the glue up, though there are some instances when the glue up or part of the glue up makes more sense to do before final shaping. Oftentimes, this is when clamping will be difficult and you can utilize the oversized pieces to create clamping spots. Most of the time though, I prefer to do the majority of the shaping while the parts are still separate, and the way I always do it is with a router and a couple different router bits. The first step is to temporarily but securely attach the template to your workpiece. I like to use double-sided tape, but you could also use clamps or the old CA glue and blue tape trick. But no matter what you do, we want the template to not move, but still be able to remove it later without destroying it. So with the template attached, I can now trim the parts to their finished shape with my router and a template bit. This bit has the bearing above the cutter head and allows me to take shallow passes and incrementally work my way down. I also prefer to use 1/2-inch shank bits when doing this, as they tend to cut smoother and not chatter as much as 1/4-inch shank bits can. So after a couple passes with the template, I can then remove it and continue working my way down until I can't go any lower. And I'll do this for all of my parts to avoid unnecessary router bit switching. So once all of my parts are trimmed on one side, I can switch out the template bit for a flush trim bit. And since this bit has the bearing below the cutter head, I now flip over all of my parts and trim the remainder in one pass. This part is where having a pretty accurate rough cut comes into play. If I had left a lot of overhang when cutting everything on the bandsaw, it might be a little tricky to trim everything in one pass, especially on thicker parts where more material is left over after using the template bit. Another thing I do when flush trimming my parts is that I leave all of the joint transition areas a little fat. That way I can come back and either sand or flush trim again all of these transitions after the glue up to make sure everything is nice and smooth. You may have also noticed that I didn't trim any of the actual joint faces on my parts, and that's because I like doing all of those on the table saw. I feel that I get a much more accurate and cleaner joint when cutting these on the table saw. I'm not going to go too in depth about this part, as this could be an entire video on its own, but I'll just hit the main points. So in order to accurately cut these joints, I like to use table saw sleds. You could also accomplish a lot of these same cuts with a miter saw or a track saw, but this is my preferred method. And once again, we can use our templates to set everything up. The main concept here is that we have a cut edge on our sled, which we line our template up to. Then we set a fence and also potentially a stop block to get perfectly repeatable cuts. And from here, I can glue up my parts, then do any final sanding or shaping in the transition areas. All right, there you go. Hopefully I was able to shed some light on how useful templates can be in woodworking and furniture making, and hopefully you were able to add a new technique to your technique toolbox. And actually, speaking of that, I wonder if Chris has figured it out yet.